If I were to ask you what state the capital of the nation is located in, the politically astute amongst you would tell me that Washington, D.C. is not located in any state, as the founders intended so that political power couldn't be unfairly weighed in favor of that state. But in 1860s Alabama, Alabamians would proudly shout out their state as the correct answer.
Welcome to my new series where I go over one interesting time in every United States history. Today it is Alabama, the state that once held the capital city of their nation. Not the United States of America, but the Confederate States of America.
Even though the Confederacy didn't spring up until the 1860s, the complex story of slavery in the United States begins almost immediately. The United States Constitution, drafted in 1787, permitted slavery in every U.S. state, with the option of abolition up to the states. However, the northern states oftentimes completely outlawed slavery, as their economies were more focused on agricultural exports, while the southern states allowed slavery, as their economies were almost completely reliant on cotton exports to foreign nations like Britain. This created a problem in Congress. Since each state received two senators, regardless of population, the government tried to have an equal number of free and slave states. This was to prevent either side having more power in the Senate and overpowering the other. However, as American expansion grew westward, every new state had to decide whether or not to permit slavery. In 1820, this came to a breaking point with Missouri's addition into the Union. If Missouri was to be admitted into the Union as a slave state, the slave states would have more power in the Senate. Tensions rose as President Monroe signed into law the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This treaty allowed Missouri into the Union as a slave state, and Maine, then part of Massachusetts, as a free state to keep the balance. However, slavery was no longer permitted north of the 3630 parallel. Tensions rose over slavery between northern and southern states as the numbers grew increasingly unbalanced. While Arkansas was admitted as a slave state in 1836, Texas in 1844, and Florida in 1845, every state to be added from then on became a free state. Michigan in 1838, Iowa in 1846, Wisconsin in 1848, California in 1850, Minnesota in 1858, and Oregon in 1859 were all admitted as free states, even though California had territory south of the 3630 parallel and was admitted under President Zachary Taylor, who was himself a slave owner. The policy from Taylor's party, the Whig Party, was all about containing slavery and prohibiting the expansion of it. However, under President James Buchanan, it seemed like the South could be getting another slave state. Despite being entirely north of the 3630 parallel, Kansas had been debating if they should join as a free or slave state, writing two state constitutions. The Free State Constitution, named the Topeka Constitution, ended up being passed, but 15th President Democrat James Buchanan had hoped the Slave Constitution, the Lecompton Constitution, would be the one that ended up being passed. However, Kansas went on to become a free state. Understandably, the South was furious. The straw that broke the camel's back was in November 1860. On the 6th of November 1860, the presidential election of 1860 was held. It seemed as if it was two different elections, one in the North and one in the South. Republican Abraham Lincoln won every northern state, with the exception of New Jersey. However, he was so unpopular in the South, he wasn't even printed on any of their ballots. Lincoln was unpopular because his Republican Party had their platform built upon containing slavery and not permitting its expansion. While he never directly called for the abolition of slavery, the South was convinced that that was what he meant. The Democrats had a split convention. Stephen Douglas was nominated as the official party nominee, which angered the Southern wing of the party as they broke off from the Democrats, nominating Vice President John Breckinridge for president. He won all the Southern states with four exceptions: Missouri, which voted for Douglas, and Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, which voted for Constitutional Unionist Party nominee John Bell. No surprise, Lincoln won all but three of the northern electoral votes, won the election, and was sent to Washington in March 1861. However, before he had even got there, he was governing less states than Buchanan had. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union, stating slavery as the main cause for their secession. They were quickly joined by Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, and of course, Alabama. On the 4th of February, 1861, these states sent representatives to Montgomery, Alabama, to the Montgomery Convention, the first secession state convention. A provisional government of the Confederacy would be created in Montgomery. All federal lands were seized as the Confederacy expanded into Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and importantly, Virginia. When Jefferson Davis had been sworn in as President of the Confederacy on February 18th, Virginia had not joined, as they joined on April 17th. With Virginia's addition into the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia's capital, became the largest and most important city in the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis decided to move the capital and Confederate government to Richmond, away from Montgomery, thus revoking Montgomery, Alabama's status as the capital of the Confederacy. On April 2nd, 1865, with the Confederates all but officially having lost the war, the Confederate government fled Richmond with Union troops on their way to conquer their capital. Instead of moving the capital further south, Davis decided to keep the capital in Virginia, in the small city of Danville. Danville was the shortest-lived capital in the Confederacy because Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on the 9th of April, 1865, ending the fight in the Civil War 1 week later. On the 12th, Union troops were sent in all across the South, beginning the process of Reconstruction, which ended in 1877. Montgomery, a largely unknown city before 1860, became the city at the top of every Union soldier's mind for a whole 2 seconds. Stick around for next time when I go over how the United States almost lost Alaska.